At the darkest moment in history, when the world believes it has achieved peace under a single government and a single leader, prophetic betrayal will be unleashed. The Antichrist, after signing a pact with Israel, will break his alliance in the middle of Daniel's 70th week, and what seemed like stability will turn into prophetic terror. He will enter the Temple of Jerusalem, desecrate the holy place, and proclaim himself God. Then the hunt will begin. Israel will be persecuted like never before, not by enemy nations, but by the global system controlled by the Antichrist. A faithful remnant, those who have recognized the true Messiah, will have no choice but to flee for survival. Revelation chapter 12 reveals the mystery. The woman, symbol of the people of Israel, is attacked by the dragon. But God prepares a place for her in the desert, a miraculous refuge out of the reach of the beast. And many scholars point to a specific place, Petra, a city carved out of rock, hidden among mountains, impenetrable, silent, prepared since ancient times to fulfill its purpose in the last days. There, as the Antichrist establishes his dominion and demands global worship, the fleeing remnant will be sustained by God, fed, protected, while the world falls into darkness. But the question is, will Israel survive this unprecedented persecution? Will Petra really be the prophesied refuge? All right, dear listener, throughout this video, we'll be answering these troubling questions, and what you'll discover at the end about the place God has prepared for Israel will have a profound impact on you. Let's get started. Chapter 12 of Revelation presents us with one of the most enigmatic and symbolic scenes in all of biblical prophecy. There is a celestial vision in which a glorious woman appears, clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet and a crown of 12 stars. Let us read Revelation chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. And she was with child and cried out in labor, in the anguish of being delivered. Of course, here is the text transcribed and improved with greater fluency, clarity, and theological force. To answer correctly, the first thing we must discern is whether this is a literal woman or whether the term woman is being used symbolically to represent a group of people. In the book of Revelation, we find several examples where the female figure represents a spiritual or collective entity. In chapter 17, for example, the great harlot appears, a symbol of a corrupt religious system that opposes God and persecutes his servants. In contrast, chapter 19 presents the wife of the Lamb, a clear reference to the Church of Christ, purified and redeemed. Based on this symbolic background, it is not surprising to think that the woman clothed with the sun also represents a collective and not a specific individual. This interpretation opens the way for us to better understand the profound meaning of this prophetic vision. Although the scene is loaded with symbolism, the text itself, along with the testimony of the rest of Scripture, provides us with clear elements to identify this woman. However, before determining her identity, it is important to consider that over time, various interpretations have emerged as to who this female figure could be. First of all, Mary, the mother of Jesus. This interpretation is very common within Roman Catholicism, especially within the framework of dogmatic Mariology. They claim that the woman represents the Virgin Mary, who gave birth to Christ, and they see in this image an exaltation of her maternal role, even arguing that her crown of 12 stars represents her royalty as Queen of Heaven. However, this interpretation does not stand up to contextual or eschatological analysis. First, while it is true that Mary was the physical mother of Jesus, the narrative of Revelation chapter 12 transcends the event of the Messiah's birth. The woman remains active after her son is taken from the throne and is then pursued by the dragon. There is no biblical evidence that Mary was persecuted for 3.5 years, that she fled into a desert, or that she was hidden by God in a supernaturally prepared place. As Robert Thomas, an expert in eschatology and professor at the Master's Seminary, states, "This woman cannot be Mary, because the actions she performs and the experiences she goes through do not correspond to any reality in Mary's life. The persecution, the flight into the desert, and the eschatological conflict are beyond any literal historical fulfillment in his person. Furthermore, Catholicism commits a serious hermeneutical error here, elevating a prophetic symbol to a literal character without considering the narrative framework of the apocalypse, which is directed toward events of the future, not the past. In second place, some amillennialist or post-tribulationist theologians such as Augustine in his allegorical interpretation, or modern interpreters such as William Hendrickson maintain that the woman represents the church, and that the male child represents Christ, who is born from the community of faith or from the spiritual people. However, this approach presents multiple contradictions. The church did not exist before the birth of Christ, but was founded as a result of his redemptive work. As Charles Ryrie rightly states, the church did not give birth to Christ. Rather, Christ gave birth to the church. Woman cannot be the church, since the Messiah does not come from her. Furthermore, Revelation chapter 12 does not describe a spiritual birth, but the physical birth of the promised Messiah, who rules with a rod of iron and is taken to the throne of God. This can only refer to Jesus Christ, as confirmed in Psalm chapter 2 verse 9 and Revelation chapter 19 verse 15. On the other hand, the woman is on earth during the Great Tribulation, and she is persecuted by the dragon. If the woman were the church, this would imply that the church is going through the Great Tribulation, which contradicts the biblical teaching that says in Revelation chapter 3 verse 10, "Because you have kept the word of my patience, I also will keep you from the hour of trial which shall come upon the whole world to test those who dwell on the earth." Now, the question is, who is the woman then? Based on the prophetic structure and the parallels with the Old Testament, the only coherent and biblical interpretation is that the woman represents Israel. Revelation chapter 12 verse 1 says, "A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars." This description has a direct connection with Genesis chapter 37 verse 9, where Joseph recounts his dream. "Behold, I have dreamed another dream, and behold, the sun and the moon and 11 stars bowed down to me." Jacob, Israel, interprets this dream as a representation of himself, Rachel, and the children of Israel. It is evident that the sun, the moon, and the 12 stars are national symbols, not ecclesiastical or individual ones. This is also confirmed by John Walvoord. The best interpretation is to see the woman as a symbol of Israel in its messianic role, giving birth to the Savior. This is consistent with the Old Testament symbols and the prophetic thread of God's dealings with his people. The woman, then, represents Israel in both its historical and eschatological dimensions. Historically, because the promised Messiah was born from Israel. Eschatologically, because after the rapture of the church, Israel will once again be the earthly people through whom God will execute his judgments and preserve a faithful remnant for the final fulfillment of his purposes. Now, having considered this, we must understand that the prophetic framework in which the woman's flight into the desert takes place is not isolated or disconnected from the rest of God's redemptive plan. Quite the contrary, it is strategically placed within the final events that describe the consummation of time, according to the plan revealed in the Scriptures. This event must be understood within the prophetic sequence described by the books of Daniel, Matthew, Thessalonians, and Revelation. The most imminent event in God's eschatological calendar is the rapture of the church, which marks the departure of Christ's body from this world before God's wrath is poured out upon the earth. The church will be suddenly taken up to meet the Lord in the air. This fulfills the principle that God delivers his faithful before judgment, as he did with Noah before the flood and with Lot before the destruction of Sodom. After the rapture, a new era will begin, known as the 70th week of Daniel, a 7-year period of prophetic fulfillment in which God will resume direct contact with Israel. Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, indicates that the prince who is to come, the Antichrist, will confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. However, in the middle of that week, 3.5 years later, he will break the covenant and unleash an unprecedented persecution against the holy people. It is at this point in the tribulation that the event of the woman fleeing into the wilderness, mentioned in Revelation chapter 12, is situated. According to the sacred text, this woman is persecuted by the dragon, who is none other than Satan. However, she manages to escape to a place prepared by God to be sustained for 1,260 days. That figure corresponds exactly to 3.5 years, which coincides with the second half of the Great Tribulation, when the beast will establish its global dominion. The abomination of desolation will be placed in the temple, and the dragon's wrath will be turned against the faithful remnant of the Jewish people. The progression is clear. First, the rapture of the church, then the revelation of the man of sin. Then comes the signing of the covenant. And in the middle of the week, the breaking of the covenant, the desecration of the temple, and the persecution. It is then that the woman flees to a hidden place, designed by God as a refuge. Let us read Revelation chapter 12, verses 13 and 14. And when the dragon saw that he was cast unto the earth, he persecuted the woman which had given birth to the man-child. And to the woman were given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness to her place, where she is nourished for a time, and times, and half a time, from the face of the serpent. This event, although presented symbolically in the Apocalypse, is firmly linked to the literal fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecies. Jesus himself anticipated this when he said in Matthew chapter 24, verse 16, "Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains." This warning is not directed at the church, since it will then be with the Lord, but at the believing Jews who will have recognized Jesus as the Messiah during the first years of the tribulation, and that they will now be protected by God from the persecution of the Antichrist. The place to which the woman flees is not accidental. It is a place prepared by God, an expression that shows sovereign planning, divine geography, and prophetic care. The same God who led his people through the wilderness, who fed Elijah with ravens, and who hid Moses in a basket among the reeds, is now the one who will prepare a real, physical, and miraculously sustained hiding place for his persecuted people. In this context, the passage from Revelation chapter 12 is not a mythical or merely symbolic account. It is a precise revelation that is part of the eschatological development ordained by God. The conflict between the dragon and the woman is not new. It is the same conflict that began in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, when God said there would be enmity between the serpent and the seed of the woman. In the last days, that conflict will reach its climax. Therefore, this event must be prophetically placed after the rapture, during the second half of Daniel's 70th week, and at the most dangerous time for the Jewish people, when the Antichrist has betrayed his covenant and seeks to annihilate the remnant who have believed in the true Messiah. But at that very time, God will hide them. Now, why is Israel persecuted, and where does it flee? The text takes us to a cosmic and decisive event, a great war in the heavens. Michael and his angels battle the dragon, Satan, who is eventually defeated and cast out of heaven. Let's read Revelation chapter 12, verse 9. And the great dragon was thrown down, that old serpent, called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. This event marks a prophetic turning point. Satan no longer has access to heaven as an accuser, and he descends in great wrath, knowing that his time is short. It is then, at that precise moment of the prophecy that corresponds to the middle of the 70th week of Daniel, that is, the remaining 3.5 years of the Great Tribulation, when the dragon directs his fury directly against the woman, that is, the faithful remnant of Israel. This is what the text in Revelation chapter 12, verse 6 declares, "And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, that they should feed her there for 1,260 days." This act of flight is not symbolic, but prophetically literal. It is not a desperate action, but a strategy anticipated in God's sovereign plan. The expression, "a place prepared by God," indicates divine foresight and prophetic geography. God will not only hide his people, but he has already prepared the place where they will be sustained. But what triggers this flight? The key lies in the prophetic context of Matthew chapter 24. The Lord Jesus Christ himself, referring to end-time events, warned, "Therefore, when you see standing in the holy place the abomination of desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains." This event, the abomination of desolation, refers to the desecration of the temple by the Antichrist, who in the midst of the tribulation will enter the holy place and proclaim himself as God, as stated in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 4, who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he as God sits in the temple, showing himself that he is God. This abomination unleashes the Antichrist's direct persecution against the Jews who believed in Jesus as the Messiah during the first part of the tribulation. At that moment, the woman will flee. The flight will be a direct response to the desecration of the temple and the beginning of the Great Tribulation, the darkest period in human history. This act was also foretold by the prophet Daniel in chapter 9, verse 27. But at midweek he will put an end to sacrifices and offerings, and he will set up in the temple the abomination that causes destruction. Also in Daniel chapter 12, verse 1 we read, "At that time Michael, the archangel who stands guard over your nation, will arise. Then there will be a time of trouble, such as has not been the case since the beginning of the nations. However, at that time, every one of your people whose name is written in the book will be redeemed." Therefore, the persecution described in Revelation chapter 12, verse 6 occurs after Satan is cast out of heaven and after the abomination of desolation, and gives way to a God-planned flight. The place the woman is headed to is a desert, which in the Bible implies both physical isolation and spiritual protection. The text specifies a precise duration, 1,260 days, equivalent to 3.5 years. This figure is not an isolated one. It appears repeatedly in Revelation chapters 11 and 13, and in Daniel chapters 7 and 12, and is the full duration of the Great Tribulation. Arnold Fruchtenbaum, Messianic theologian and defender of the pre-tribulationist line, comments on this: "This Jewish remnant will flee into the desert, just as Jesus indicated in Matthew chapter 24, and will be protected by God during the last 3.5 years of the tribulation, while the Antichrist sits in the temple as if he were God. This place prepared by God is probably Petra in Edom." In other words, the believing people of Israel, the Messianic remnant, will recognize the sign given by Jesus, the desecration of the temple. Then they will flee, and God will provide them with supernatural sustenance for 1,260 days, while judgment is carried out on the world. This will not be a human escape, nor a military resistance, but a divine intervention that recalls what God did in the past. Hide Moses in the Nile, David in the caves, Elijah in the brook Cherith, and Jesus in Egypt. This is how it will be in the days of the end. Women will be persecuted but not destroyed, because the same God who allowed the tribulation is the one who has already prepared a place for their protection. Now, when Revelation chapter 12 verse 6 states that the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days, we're not just talking about a dry geography. The desert in the Bible is a setting laden with spiritual, historical, and prophetic significance. In first place, we must understand that in the eschatological context of Revelation, the desert is not a vague metaphor. It is a real, specific, and geographically significant region. Throughout the Bible, the wilderness has been a literal place where God has worked powerfully to protect, purify, and shape his people. In the case of the woman, believing Israel, her flight into the desert will not be symbolic, but literal. She will escape from the area of the desecrated temple in Jerusalem, cross Judea, and head toward a desert region, prepared by God as a refuge, in fulfillment of Christ's words in Matthew chapter 24, verse 16. "Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains." Arnold Fruchtenbaum, in his work Footsteps of the Messiah, explains that this desert will most likely be the region of Petra in Edom, present-day Jordan, a historically uninhabited area with hidden rock formations, ideal for hiding from a global surveillance system like that of the Antichrist. Fruchtenbaum also cites Isaiah chapter 33 verses 15 to 16, which speaks of the righteous who will dwell in fortresses of rock and will be provided with bread and water. For many eschatologists, this prophecy points to that place of refuge. We also know that, throughout Scripture, the desert has been the setting where God hides and protects his people from judgment. In Egypt, God hid Moses in a basket among the reeds. In the Exodus, he led Israel to the Sinai desert, where he fed them with manna from heaven and protected them with cloud and fire. Elijah, pursued by Jezebel, was led by God to the brook Cherith, where he was fed by ravens. Jesus himself was taken into the desert before beginning his public ministry, where he was tested, yet also strengthened by the Holy Spirit. These examples reveal a divine pattern. God uses the desert to hide, speak, purify, and provide. As Hosea chapter 2 verse 14 says, "But behold, I will allure her and bring her into the wilderness, and will speak tenderly unto her." This passage, originally addressed to Israel in its unfaithfulness, is also fulfilled at the end of time. The desert will be the place where God will restore the hearts of his people during those 1,260 days of refuge. Several dispensational theologians have noted that the wilderness in Revelation chapter 12 echoes the wilderness of the Exodus. There, Israel was preserved from Pharaoh. Here, it will be preserved from the Antichrist. In both cases, there is an enemy with absolute political power. God intervenes with supernatural signs. The people are not saved by human weapons or strategies, but by divine grace and provision. Sustenance comes from heaven. Tim LaHaye, in his commentary on Revelation, states, "The wilderness becomes a repetition of God's dealings with Israel in the past. Just as he sustained them for 40 years in the desert, he will do so for 3.5 years at the end of time." This isn't spiritual romanticism. It's a reaffirmation of God's unchanging character. He who cared for his people under the shadow of a cloud will do so again in a world where the dragon has unleashed his full fury. He will do so where the Antichrist's technology, the drones of the world system, and the mark of the beast cannot reach. And he won't just hide them. The text says, "so that they may sustain it there." God will feed them, as he did with manna. He will provide, as he did with water from the rock. He will guard, as he did with the shoes that didn't wear out in 40 years. God's faithfulness will remain the same, but now in an eschatological dimension. Therefore, the desert in Revelation chapter 12 is not merely a figure of speech, nor an inner experience, nor poetic language. It is a real place, a physical refuge, and at the same time a stage of spiritual purification. There, the remnant of Israel will be preserved from the Antichrist, away from the false prophet, hidden from the beast system, and sustained by the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It is in the desert that Israel will reunite with its Redeemer, and it will be from that place that it will emerge purified, ready to receive the glorious Messiah who will descend in power and majesty upon the Mount of Olives. Now the key question is, where is the place prepared by God? First, Petra, the refuge in the rock. The most widely held position among theologians is that this place will be Petra, also known as Selah, located in the ancient territory of Edom, south of the current kingdom of Jordan. Petra is an ancient city, literally carved out of rock, surrounded by cliffs and arid mountains, and with narrow natural access points that make it a natural fortress. Its main entrance, known as the Seek, is a narrow canyon over a kilometer long, with vertical walls reaching 80 meters in height. Strategically, it is one of the easiest places to defend in a pursuit. Arnold Fruchtenbaum, in his influential work Footsteps of the Messiah, states, "The most likely place of refuge for the Jewish remnant during the Great Tribulation is Petra in Edom." In Daniel chapter 11 verse 41 it says, "He will enter the glorious land, and many provinces will fall, but these will escape from his hand, Edom and Moab, and most of the children of Ammon." This verse clearly states that there is one region that the Antichrist will not be able to conquer, an exception during his world empire. That region is precisely Transjordan, which includes Edom, where Petra is, Moab and Ammon, what today corresponds to the Kingdom of Jordan. This escape is not due to the Antichrist's lack of military capability, but to the sovereign intervention of God, who has reserved that territory as a refuge for his people. John Walvoord, one of the most respected theologians in futurist eschatology, comments, "It is no coincidence that the region of Edom, Moab, and Ammon is beyond the reach of the Antichrist. God has provided this land as a literal refuge for the Jewish remnant, fulfilling both Revelation 12 and Daniel chapter 11. This place, then, is a desert, mountainous, arid, and difficult to access area, yet it has historically served as a natural hiding place for persecuted peoples. Petra, in particular, was a refuge for the Nabateans, who took advantage of its geographical location to resist invaders for centuries. Now, another line of evidence that reinforces this interpretation comes from Isaiah chapter 63, verses 1 through 4. In that passage, the prophet has a vision of the Messiah returning from judgment, with garments dipped in blood. Let us note what the biblical account says. Who is this coming from Edom, from Bozrah, with crimson garments? This one beautiful in his attire, marching in the greatness of his power? I, who speak righteousness, am mighty to save. Why is your garment red, and your clothing like that of one who treads the winepress? I trod the winepress alone, and from the peoples there was no one with me. I have trampled them in my anger, and trampled them in my wrath, and their blood has splashed my garments, and I have stained all my raiment. For the day of vengeance is in my heart, and the year of my redeemed has come. Bozrah is an ancient city in Edom, near Petra. The scene depicts the Messiah returning from executing judgment on the nations that attacked the remnant refugees in that area. Therefore, Petra and its surrounding area will not only be a place of refuge, but the stage where the Messiah will first descend at his second coming to free his people. This harmonizes with Zechariah chapter 14, verse 5, which says, "And you will flee to the valley of the mountains, for the valley of the mountains will reach to Azal. You will flee as you fled from the earthquake in the days of Uzziah king of Judah, and the Lord my God will come, and all the saints with him." Many scholars, such as Clarence Larkin and David Reagan, argue that Christ's route of return in glory will include Petra Bozrah, then move on to Jerusalem, where he will fight the Battle of Armageddon. Therefore, the place prepared by God in Revelation chapter 12 is a physical refuge, real and eschatologically significant. The scriptures point to the region of Edom, especially Petra, as the place where the Jewish remnant will be protected from the persecution of the Antichrist. There, God's final agreement with Israel will be fulfilled. It will be their place of refuge, sustenance, spiritual intercourse, and also the starting point for the glorious manifestation of Christ at his second coming. God has prepared a refuge for his people, and in the days of the Great Tribulation, that place will be a further sign that he remains faithful to his eternal covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, the woman's flight into the desert is not only a strategy of divine protection, but a sovereign act of grace to purify the remnant of Israel and prepare them spiritually for the encounter with the Messiah. In that place prepared by God during the last 3.5 years of the Great Tribulation, the Jewish people who have believed in Jesus will be hidden not only from the Antichrist, but also of the judgment God will execute upon the world. But beyond physical protection, the desert will be the stage where God will engage with his people on a deep, spiritual, restorative level. As Ezekiel announced in chapter 20, verses 37 and 38, "I will cause you to pass under the rod and bring you into the bonds of the covenant, and I will remove from among you the rebels and those who have transgressed against me." At the same time, as Zechariah said in chapter 13, verse 9, only a third will be saved, will pass through the fire of affliction and come out as purified gold, crying out with all their heart to the God they had previously rejected. There, in that divinely designed isolation, God will not only preserve a people, but form a new one, a broken Israel, free of national pride, without confidence in its own strength, completely surrendered to the Messiah they had previously rejected. And then the eternal covenant with Abraham will be fulfilled, not on the basis of works or merit, but by the faithfulness of God, who does not reject his people. In that wilderness, the remnant will raise a cry. Let's read Zechariah chapter 12, verse 10. and they will look on me, whom they have pierced, and they will mourn for him as one mourns for an only son, and they will grieve for him as one grieves for a firstborn. This lament will be authentic, not liturgical. It will not be in a temple or a synagogue, but during affliction, when they understand that the one they despised was the only one who could save them. And then, as Jesus declared in Matthew 23:39, he will not return until Israel says, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." The refuge, therefore, is also the place of encounter. There, in the silence of the desert, the remnant will be prepared to receive the King. And when the heavens open, the Messiah will come not first to Jerusalem, but to Edom, to Bozrah, where his people await him, just as Isaiah chapter 63 prophesies. What was once a desert will become a spiritual delivery room, where a new nation will be born in a single day. The woman who was hidden will emerge, transformed, redeemed, and ready to march with her king toward Jerusalem. Thus, the purpose of refuge is not only to save the lives of the remnant, but to prepare his soul for the greatest event in history, the return of the glorified Messiah. We've reached the end of this video. We hope it's been a blessing, uplifting, and has brought prophetic light into your life. Until next time, God bless.